what it means to use film as a language for peace.
Film and video has become so much more powerful through the social media.
Looking at Gaza, Ukraine, and Afghanistan,
Gaza does not stand on its own. Gaza is part of the Palestinian territory.
Power seems to decide everything right now.
We have a strong law, we have enforcement, we have everything, and yet everybody breaks it.
What common thread do you see in these failures of protection and accountability?
Wars split people into different geographical areas.
Why did you choose Central Asia for this initiative? Hi, welcome to CPR Talks. Today I'm joined by Stefan Ziegler, a humanitarian practitioner, lecturer, and documentary filmmaker who has spent more than 25 years working at the intersection of international humanitarian law, advocacy, and education. Stefan has served with the International Committee of the Red Cross, UNRWA, and OSCE, where he was part of field missions in Gaza and the West Bank, Ukraine, Serbia, and Afghanistan. He is now a visiting professor at several universities, such as the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. He is also the founder of Advocacy Production in Geneva and the director of two acclaimed documentaries called Broken and the Mandate for Whom International Law Matters. So in this episode, we will examine how international humanitarian law remains important in a world of constant conflicts and what it means to use film as a language for peace and how countries like Uzbekistan can help enhance international humanitarian dialogue. Stefan, welcome. So, Stefan, you've often described international law as a language for peace. Yet, looking at Gaza, Ukraine, and Afghanistan, that language seems increasingly disregarded. Where does international humanitarian law still hold moral and practical authority today?
First of all, thank you for receiving me. I actually make the distinction between international law of conflict and international humanitarian law, because international humanitarian law is only one part of the international law that governs conflict. Because you have international human rights law, for example, that's applicable in war. And so when I call international law a language for peace, it's simply because I think it is a language or a code that can, if it want to be, understood. And thus, we have the language. And thus, we don't need to invent a new language if we want to have peace. I think what we need to do, and I'm sure we'll come back to that during your podcast, is to validate this type of language. And maybe just to tell you briefly, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
I've been here for the last 4 days in your country, Uzbekistan, and before that I was in Kyrgyzstan, and I was in Kazakhstan for a few days. So this may be the 10th or 11th day of my trip. And apart from events like your own and such events that I think are important to get the voice of peace out, if you wish, I've been doing a lot of the universities that invited me through the program that we have with the Swiss government, or the Swiss embassy in this case. And I was actually very positively surprised that countries that are not at war, doesn't mean they're not tensions sometimes, but that are not at war, that these young people understand this idea of that we have a language, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. So, all of these three countries here, their youth, albeit youth that study international law predominantly, They're switched on. And I think that's important. So if we told them that this is a language for peace, I don't think they would misunderstand or be baffled by that. So.
Okay, how do you explain to students and young diplomats why international law, or particularly international humanitarian law, matters when power seems to decide everything right now?
Yeah, I remember 2 nights ago we were in a session here in this town, and these were people with very different backgrounds. Many of them human rights. There was also a few people from the army and so on. So it was a really open forum. And I remember I got a similar question, and I said, well, what's the speed limit on the motorways in your country, in Uzbekistan? Now, maybe the translation wasn't great because they came up with different figures, but I think it's around 100, right? 100 kilometers per hour, right?
It depends, like here maybe like 60 kilometers.
Okay.
Like inside city.
No, on the motorways.
Motorways, it's
the open
100,
road.
Yeah.
So I presume, when I look at the way people drive in the city, that they will probably not stick to the 100. So we have a strong law, we have enforcement, we have everything, and yet everybody breaks it. Yeah. So this is a little bit my cheap way out of your question, okay? But I think it is important to realize that, because it also shows another thing. It shows that domestic law, that we usually associate with, police force, with powers that be, the courts, and all of that, would prevent crimes, whatever description, from happening. So when people say, well, international law doesn't have an enforcement mechanism and is weak, as kind of you suggested, which I fully agree with you, it's kind of interesting to think about how do you compare that to the law, even if it's broken every day on the motorways, for example, right? Because, yeah.
I think this is also very interesting. When I was a student, one of the American professors told me that youngsters who grew up in this part of the world see international relations differently than American students. For example, most of American students, they are very liberal. They believe with American power they can bring lots of changes. But he was arguing that here students are we are living near conflicts like Afghanistan, or like we have conflict Ukraine. Yeah, people are more youngsters tend to be more cynical. They mostly believe in power, or I don't know, balance of power, the different international relations theory. But this is also very interesting. So Stefan, let's unpack the basics for listeners. At the heart of international humanitarian law are the principles like distinction, proportionality, necessity, and humanity. In your experience, which of these principles is most consistently violated, which remained most misunderstood?
Well, let me go back a little bit, because the ones that you quote are the UN's 4 principles, while the ICRC, for example, or the Geneva Conventions have 7. Now, they are the stronger ones that you're mentioning, but they're not all-inclusive, if you wish, the ones that you mentioned. And it's only important because I think even the interpretation of those concepts, in law, they're pretty clear. But when it goes outside into the realm of power, the army maybe, the army, they become elastic, and that's a problem. Either you stick to that language that I mentioned, and that includes those principles. But if you think that they are not principles, then maybe we should address that as a problem in the first place. I'll illustrate what I'm saying, okay? I'm going to illustrate that, but I'm not quite sure whether there is one or the other that's more broken or not. Now, what we see at the moment, certainly, the idea of neutrality is, in humanitarian action, is broken more than anything else. So the disrespect for humanitarian workers or humanitarian actions, they're grave infringements on humanity, not just on the law. They are on humanity, because I think we're all ashamed somehow that this world could turn in such a short time into something that we really didn't. We as people of this planet didn't anticipate. And so I think it's the neutrality that's broken the most. The independence is another one that is not very well respected. Independence in the humanitarian sense, in the Geneva Conventions, pertains to you're independent of your donors, for example. So you don't feed only Muslims, but you don't feed Christians, which that's part of warfare these days. But that would be another one that is grossly impacted. And it makes sense. I mean, these principles are really well developed. They have been, in literature ever since 1863 or 64 when the first Geneva Convention came out. So I think these are the two. Then the idea of impartiality, of course, that again is broken. It has different consequences, and that's why I wouldn't necessarily say one is more broken than the other, but they have very different consequences.
Right. Interesting. Thank you for your insight. So, Stefan, you've worked in several conflict zones where international humanitarian law is consistently tested. Let's take, for example, Gaza, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. So each represent a different kind of breakdown, right? For example, siege warfare, conventional state conflict, and post-withdrawal collapse. So what common thread do you see in these failures of protection and accountability?
Just one clarification. Gaza does not stand on its own. Gaza is part of the Palestinian territory. And it is enshrined as such. So it's not, many journalists, I'm not pointing to you here, but many journalists make that mistake because it splits a people in two. And that's not what the Palestinians see themselves as. Afghanistan is a very different conflict. But I think the two most talked about conflicts are the Palestinian-Israeli and the Russian-Ukrainian one. And here, yes, that is a trend. And the problem with those very visible wars, they change the language. Again, the language that we try to preserve, we as humanitarians and thinkers and intellectuals and so on. Because, of course, the problem is if a big nation, doesn't matter which one, a strong nation, financially, militarily, and so on, breaks those traditions of international law, especially the fundamental principles, then who is going to tell those over 80 other countries that are at war at most times these days? You can't do that. I think it sets very dangerous precedents. It's probably always been a little bit the case. In the previous wars, it was the Americans that changed, and the British changed the language the way you wanted it to be for themselves, and with similar detrimental impacts. But there's politics in this. I mean, politics is anyway in everything, but there is politics in how you use wars, in terms of how you want to see yourself positioned politically. And those are the people that are not really interested in fundamental principles. Hence, those are the people that make them into elastic, principles, law terms, and so on.
Thank you. Stefan, you're one of the few people who turned international humanitarian law into visual storytelling. So your films, Broken and The Mandate, are not just documentaries. They are kind of form of advocacy and education, right? So why did you decide to use these films to communicate legal principles rather than academic writing or policy work?
Impact.
Okay.
I often ask myself, all these academics that write journal articles, the proliferation of writing journal articles and solving problems in the world that are basic doesn't seem to have any correlation, okay? So
yeah, in most cases, I know most academic papers are very complicated. They're written by very, I don't know, convoluted quite technical language, and it might be very hard to give some impact to ordinary people, maybe students, right? Like I think in this sense, visual storytelling is very effective, especially with Gen Zs and Alpha generations, I guess.
if I may go back to what I said originally about article writing and so on, there is one aspect that you didn't mention, and that is the proliferation of writing for writing's sake, because your salary as an academic is often dependent on how many publications you make, whether you move up the ladder or not. And that to me is not, it's self-serving, but it serves very little else. In any discipline, I think the social sciences are though much more at the fore, because that's the only thing they can do. They're not producing anything. So maybe this is a cynical way of looking at it. But I'll use the same argument about my former employers, if you wish. So with the ICRC, ICRC has a certain way of dealing with things, which is not always understood. Even the BBC calls the International Committee of the Red Cross the Red Cross. Mm. It's not the Red Cross. It is the International Committee of the Red Cross. So it's watering down things. And the ICRC has a particular way of dealing with things, because some of their work is highly confidential, because otherwise they wouldn't have access to the victims, they wouldn't have access to these people that are, fighting the wars. And we see that in the exchange of prisoners, also in Gaza right now. So that I understand. And I think that's incredibly important. However, the ICRC also came up with a term maybe a decade or so ago, which calls humanitarian advocacy, humanitarian diplomacy. That to me is a very pretentious thing to do, because it appears all of a sudden that humanitarians are doing all of this through diplomatic means. That's not correct, right? So again, it's about language and how we, interpret it, and why it's been called that way rather than something else. And of course, there are many reasons for this. When I was working for them and later for the UN and so on, that are less difficult maybe to message with. After so many years, I felt I don't think that my contribution is as useful in those organizations. I felt, people tap on your fingers all the time, especially if you're a creative thinker and a very active analyst and so on. So I thought, try film, because I tried also, obviously, and I still do, use teaching as a method. But I told some of the diplomatic students today, I said, there's only so many people you can teach a day. And teaching is a very tiresome job, because it takes a lot of energy trying to make sure that they get everything right. And that on the spur of the moment. So it's great to be interactive with students, but it takes a lot of energy. So that means you cannot teach 8 hours a day. And even if you did, and you had classes the size of, between 5 and maybe 20 people in postgraduate studies, what's the outreach that you have? It's negligible. It's nice, and if it's directed at the right people that can then, kind of the TOT approach, the training of trainers approach, that has a really good place in the world. But it's still limited normally to either academics or to a very small number of other people. So I said to myself, I think I know enough about messaging, not about filmmaking. That was not what I had in mind. But I turned to film, and I think now, 10 years later, I'm right, and I was right to do so for two reasons. One, because film and video has become so much more powerful through the social media, so you can proliferate ideas and messages at a speed and at volumes that is, mind-boggling. I mean, to our generation, mine certainly. So that's on the one hand that, but I also think that if you do the quality of film in a very concerted effort, and again to the students I said, my type of advocacy, which is using filmmaking as a vehicle, is extremely well researched. There is no mistakes. Well, maybe in the subtitles, but other than that, it has been chewed over and over. So when it comes out, there is no misunderstanding of the content. It's just how the content can be differently presented. And so, of course, I mean, we are creative human or creatures, but I think if you do it right in this field, you can reach a huge amount of people, especially if you use film for teaching. And this is what I do. Not just me. Now I'm in the phase, and I tested the waters here in the region, and today was an exceptional day. I realized that the willingness of, let's say, acquiring my films for university purposes is very strong, because the teachers then use my film, and I don't have to come back each day to do the same thing again, right? So this is a long answer to a short
it's
question.
amazing.
Right?
I also teach. This is something I should keep in mind for future, maybe for better impact on society, on youngsters.
Yeah.
Stefan, your tour has included lectures and screening in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and now in Uzbekistan, focusing on education, advocacy, and audiovisuals as 3 pillars, right? So why did you choose Central Asia for this initiative? And what role do you think countries like Uzbekistan could play in global humanitarian conversation?
Okay, choosing is probably not the right word, because it wasn't me going on the world map. Oh, I'll go to Kazakhstan tomorrow. It's a long process that I started with the Swiss embassies, because they can open doors. I mean, if I came here and I said, who can do a podcast with me? I'd be here for weeks, okay? But the vehicle here is the, what did I say? ICRC? No, it's the Swiss embassies, who open doors through their natural contacts with their natural interest in proliferating international humanitarian law and human rights law. And thus, I've been chosen in a sense, but it's of course not the only country, right? My film, first of all, my first film, I think probably has been shown in half of the countries of the world. It is in hundreds and hundreds of universities as a licensed film. So tens of thousands of students are being taught with the old film. The new one it's only kind of now coming into vogue, right? And so this year I was in film festivals and places that, really make sense, and they're not always universities by any means, okay? We've been asked to show the film in a discussion group, a big, about 700 people, when in Geneva, to introduce the Palestine-Israel civil society representatives who started to work very strongly together again during these years of calamities. I mean, that to me is what I wanted to achieve, because these are the people that will take heart in the messaging that I do. And yes, I was in Luxembourg. In Luxembourg, for example, I was teaching teachers to teach a subject they have never taught. That was a great experiment, because here you're looking at international law is not known. I mean, we know that, except in universities and certain departments, but it's really not known by the ordinary person in the street and so on. So I think that approach, and it was paid for by the Ministry of Education in Luxembourg. You know, I never thought that I would get that far, but I think it's based on the fact that I use strong evidence, that I use international law as that vehicle that gets, more and more people to be able to appreciate or to learn from my products. Okay.
Oh, thank you. So, you talked about neutrality. Let's come back to neutrality. As far as I mentioned, you worked for international institutions like the ICRC and then OECE, so both rooted in neutrality, right? In today's polarized world, where neutrality is often criticized as moral evasion, so can it still be defended as a humanitarian virtue, or now everything is different?
No, not everything is different. I think it's just ignored. The law hasn't changed. We don't need to change the international law. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it gives enough grounds on which we can judge whether a behavior of some countries or people or powerful people and so on is correct or not. The OSCE I would exclude from being neutral, because it's 57 states, and they do argue against each other. I'm still working for the OSCE from time to time. This is how I came to Uzbekistan as a election observer. So it's in the government and good government and the domain of good governance, and it's in the domain of democracy and so on. But I've also gotten to know how the OSCE, or ODIHR is an arm of it, so that's whom I usually work for. But the OSCE is dictated. Sometimes it's comparable to the Security Council in the UN. So it's more hindering processes of peace enforcement and so on than it is not. So I'm coming back to the idea of neutrality. I had a fantastic professor one time. Well, he was actually not my professor. He was a trainer at the ICRC. And he said, Stefan, neutrality is not what you think it is. In other words, neutrality is not what you would like others to believe you are. It's what others believe or not believe. That's crucial, because a lot of people don't make that distinction. Neutrality, I can tell you, but I'm neutral. And you can say, no, Stefan, you're not. So what I think has no influence over you. So if you believe that you or I or an organization can make themselves neutral, that doesn't work, okay? It's what the others believe. And once we realize that it is our actions that people judge by, because it has a lot to do with trust. If I take a Land Cruiser into a war zone with a big flag on the back, ICRC, the Red Cross, and so on, going, whatever, trying to help some people out and so on with maybe food and so on, I can drive through most places in the world where the ICRC has a certain accreditation by the host country, and that is good, because it means that at least the ICRC is still seen as neutral. But if I drive into any old war zone with my vehicle, I'm lucky if both sides see this flag as a protective emblem, which signals neutrality. If, however, the day before, one of the warring factions abused the emblem, then the trust has been broken. And I'm no longer neutral. I didn't do anything. I'm still the same guy with the same jeep and everything. But if that emblem was used to kill people out of a white-looking truck, then the neutrality is gone. And to re-establish that is incredibly cumbersome, expensive, and we're not sure whether everybody has heard the same message. Because wars split people into different geographical areas, and you can never assume that you spoke to that top guy in the capital with the epaulettes and the green uniform, whether everybody in the field has actually gotten the same message. You hope, but probably not the case.
Thank you. So let's look ahead. If international humanitarian law is to remain relevant in the 21st century, of course it's relevant. What needs to change? The rules, institutions, or the mindset of states, maybe great powers like who are sitting on the Security Council of United Nations?
So the states are not going to change. So let's drop that one. I think we're not very good at betting on those, okay? Because they have so much self-interest and so on that, us, like-minded people have very little to say. I think it's education, and maybe in a different way than we would understand. This is not the education at school necessarily. It can be and it should be. It's also including the education of young people at universities or not so young people anymore who should be informed of the existence of international law. Nobody needs to learn the articles in the Geneva Conventions. That would be silly, okay? That turns off anybody, from learning about international law. But a little bit about the principles. I think a couple of the things that I told you during our podcast here will suffice for people, and I quote a 15-year-old, well, she's now 19, but 15-year-old, who came to our project through watching our film, and then developed such a strong interest in what we do. She even started to help us out with getting international law taught at her school. They made podcasts with it. So she was a real motivator, okay? Fantastic. But she says, we need to know international law, anybody, if we want to be able to read the news. Because our news, the international news, is spiked with information that's based on international law. Nobody tells you this. We talk about the Security Council all the time. Well, okay, most people will just pick it up from the media and say, well, that's not a good institution. It's too old. It's this. Yeah, whatever it is, okay. But it is actually based in international law. It can be traced back, even if we don't all get to understand all the intricacies. But the fact that this is international law, I think, will make us look for more accountability in those that are kicking international law with their boots at the moment. So that's the type of education that I refer to.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
Stefan, after so many years of witnessing the best and worst of humanity, so what gives you this conviction or motivation to keep teaching or making films about international law?
You. People that are interested in what I do. That motivates me. And this is not just a throwaway remark, but it's true. It's anybody who gains something from that, because that is what I set out to do. My motto from the very beginning, when I got my own company together and so on, was my aim is to strengthen international law. That's it. I mean, it's the closing sentence of our producer statement. I think it's still exactly the same as it was that time.
Okay, finally, if you had to summarize the mandate, the film you made in one sentence, what it would be?
No. I can't. No, because the film is in 3 parts. So you have to give me at least 3.
Okay, then 3
Okay,
words.
right. So I'll give you 3 phrases.
Okay.
Okay. The mandate is giving mandate about international law by those people who are the owners of it. Experts of international law, professors, even statesmen and so on. And we, the media, that's the second point, we receive it. We receive it in trust that we will replicate it in such a way that, third, general public, the civil society, will be able to make up their own minds a little bit about international law and try to understand the consequences if we don't think about it.
Thank you, Stefan. It's always pleasure to talk to you, and thank you what you're doing for humanity, and it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thank you. Rahmat.